So I wanted to talk about my favourite part of Tau lore, and that is the students of Puretide. I'm not going to be able to cover everything about them in this video, but I wanted to cover their relationship and the parts of their lore that I think are really cool and interesting. I'm going to try and go over each of the characters individually in this video, however there is going to be a lot of overlap between the three. However, before I can get to them, I need to explain who is Puretide. He is as close as the Tau gets to having a Primarch, I guess. He is a legendary fighter who was supposedly so good in battle that even the orcs didn't enjoy fighting against him. After his many years of service, which is about 30, because Tau don't live very long, he retires to Mount Konji to share his wisdom with budding fire warriors. His top 3 students become Shadowsun, Farsight, and Case, and they are the best commanders that the Tau Empire has, and they actually grow quite close for a time. You see, they have what's called a talisera, which is like a very strong bonding ritual. If you've ever played against Tau on the tabletop, you'll be aware that their leaders and sergeants have what's called bonding knives on them, and these are devastating in the game, but mainly they represent the incredibly strong bonds that the Tau have. Yet something happened, rumoured to be Ocase's fault, which drove a wedge between them, and the friendship never quite recovered. Even though Farsight wanted to reconcile, the other two really kept their distance. So let's start off by talking about Commander Shadowsun, who recently got a promotion to Supreme Commander, keyword. Shadowsun was actually always destined for greatness. She thinks she might be the last surviving member of a famous Firecast family. Now, although she is the Supreme Commander now, it wasn't always that way. You see, there was a campaign called the Damocles Crusade, which is where the Tau fought against the Imperium. And Farsight was chosen after this crusade to be the High Commander of the Tau forces to reclaim what then becomes the Enclaves. And what's interesting here is that Shadowsun was passed over, as was Case. Now, Case was supposed to be the smartest of the three, and Shadowsun actually massively outperformed Farsight in the crusade. So why did they choose Farsight? It's actually because he's just way more photogenic. You see, Shadowsun is a master of what's called Kion, the patient hunter doctrine of the Tau Empire, whereas Farsight is a master of the Monk Ka, the killing blow style of the doctrine. Now, if you were a member of the Watercast, who would you choose for the videos and the pictures to share around? You're gonna choose the pictures of the commander who is literally firing fusion blaster shots into the heads of Gweiron Shah, or Space Marines. So whilst being the patient hunter was incredibly impressive on the battlefield, it actually looked really bad on whatever the Tau have for Instagram. So Shadowsun wasn't chosen to lead the force, and after Puretide's death, the Ethereals decided that they wanted to preserve the remaining intelligence of Puretide, so they had to keep Shadowsun and Ocase in cryostasis. Now this means that every waking moment that Shadowsun has is in war zones. She doesn't know peace at all, she only knows how to kill her next target. Now, Shadowsun's demeanour is really cold in the books, so she admits to herself that she does miss Farsight, but in a big meeting with all the top Tau commanders, she actually humiliates Farsight in front of all of them. Now, Shadowsun is kind of a legend to fans of Xenos in 40k, and to explain to you why, I have to give you a little idea of what it's like to collect Xenos. You see, Xenos characters lose all the time. Obviously, the Space Marines always come out on top. Farsight loses to Sergeant Cato Sicarius in the Damocles Crusade. I know Cato Sicarius is a bigger deal now, but like, Farsight is our best guy, and he is our only guy, sorry on she, and so it's a bit ridiculous that we just can't win any battles. So Shadowsun actually wins some battles against not just the Space Marines, but named characters. During the Third Sphere expansion, both Corsairo Khan and Kavian Shrike are both present, and she actually bests Corsairo Khan in combat. But she wasn't done there. You see, Corvin Severax was the Raven Guard chapter master at the time, and he decided to do the thing that Raven Guard do best, and that is cut the head off the snake. Unfortunately, Shadowsun had made that incredibly easy for him. Not only was she regularly fighting in the front lines, but she was also wearing her iconic battlesuit so he could find her, and he met her on the battlefield. And after a brief fight, he actually does destroy the Tau Commander. However, we later find out inside of that suit is actually just a brave Fire Warrior decoy. Before the Chapter Master realizes what's happened, Shadowsun has already decloaked behind him in a Ghost Keel battlesuit. She fires some shots from her fusion collider and actually cuts the Chapter Master in half. So she wins against the Raven Guard through stealth. She out-Raven Guards the Raven Guard. And this is why she will always be a legend to fans of the Xenos. Now later on, during the Agrellan campaign, Shadowsun is still fighting the Imperium of Man and she's in a doomed war against them. And eventually, red crisis suits start dropping from the sky, her saviors. Farsight has come to lend a hand, and this makes Shadowsun really question her relationship with Farsight. Orn Var actually asks her to kill Farsight, but she actually lets this information slip to Farsight and he is allowed to escape. So there's clearly a really interesting relationship between those two characters, and I'm really actually excited to see where that goes. So let's talk about Farsight then. So Farsight is probably the most infamous of all of the Tau Commanders, and the reason for that is because he famously defects to the Farsight Enclaves, and he then defects from the Farsight Enclaves. He's kind of a complicated guy. Now, something you should be aware of about Farsight, it is actually Farsight who creates the Puretide engram neurochip, that relic you'll be well aware of if you've ever played Tau. Now, this was a hope of the Ethereal cast to capture the intelligence of Commander Puretide. However, they actually found out that it lobotomized the people that they used it on, and this actually included Shavastos, one of Farsight's best friends, and so this is something that he's always regretted to this day. The Engram chip also basically killed Commander Puretide. Interestingly, Puretide told Farsight before he died not to trust all of them, obviously hinting at the Ethereals. Now, Farsight is an incredibly fun character to read because he's actually really smart. Yes, he's one of the Tau, he's incredibly naive to the evilness of the world of 40k, but he learns incredibly quickly and he uses science and innovation to beat his opponents. That duel I described against Cato Sicarius, like yes, Farsight does lose that duel, but he actually disables all of the Tau equipment and all of the Space Marine equipment, leaving the crew to sweep in and literally hold a knife to the throat of the Space Marines. There's also a hilarious bit in that book where Farsight notices there's often these white Space Marines, who we know to be apothecaries, that are following all the Space Marines around. And they're committing some sort of ritual over the dead Space Marines. Now, Farsight lands next to one, and this obviously freaks out the apothecary, but Farsight is there like, no, carry on, I'm just curious to see what's going on. And so he actually uses this information later on when he's talking to the Ultramarines, and he says that if they want to play dirty, that's fine, but he might just tell the Firecast to concentrate all of their firepower on these white Space Marines. And this obviously outrages the Ultramarines because their gene seed is incredibly important to them. And whilst we're on the Ultramarines, they're not the only ones that write famous books in 40k. Farsight writes the Book of the Beast, a book that details very clearly how to fight orcs. He's so good at fighting orcs, he can actually manipulate the orc war to some degree. It's in the wars against the orcs where he earns the name Farsight, where he demonstrates the ability to look far ahead. He also writes the Mirror Codex. Again, they're not particularly great at naming things, so I'm going to guess you can figure out what that one does. Farsight also brings down an entire Space Marine ship by himself. Because the Tau don't live very long and they don't have proper warp travel yet, despite some questionable experiments, they have to keep a lot of the crew in cryostasis on the way to the Enclaves, and they are ambushed by a Space Marine chapter called the Scarlords. And Farsight is unable to awaken all of the Firecast before the Scarlords would have just overrun them. And so he decides to hop into a prototype Cold Star battlesuit. He then yeets himself over to the Space Marine ship, navigates through that Space Marine ship until he finds the warp drive and destroys it. And it's quite funny at this point because demons start just flooding the ship, and Farsight is looking around thinking, these Space Marines keep really weird pets. And one of the most interesting things that we find out about Farsight in the latest book is that Farsight is sought after by both Khorne and Tzeentch. Khorne, because Farsight wears red, I presume. And Tzeentch, because Tzeentch hates the Tau, because the Tau are unified and you can't use deception. They massively diminish his power. And so he actually sees Farsight as a gateway into corrupting the Tau Empire. It's also implied that Farsight is somewhat prophetic because he has dreams of a big battle where Ethereals will die and he has to fight a Bloodthirster. He's also pretty sure that this Bloodthirster is not going to be open to coming to the ways of the greater good. And this comes true at Arthur's Moloch, a defining battle for Farsight, where he encounters demons for the first time, and an Ethereal let slip that they were aware of the demons all this time and never told the Firecast. Now here, Farsight shows his incredible adaptability in this moment, because he's never fought demons before, but he figures out how to close a warp portal on his own. Farsight also looks into the portal and sees the future. He sees himself crowned as a warrior king above Shadowsun and Case, and he also sees the birth of the Citrix Maledictum. Now, the straw that breaks the camel's back for Farsight is this lie about the existence of demons and the warp. And he wants to leave, he does, but he doesn't want to go back to the time of Montau, a time where the Tau tribes were constantly warring with each other, and this is before the Ethereals came along. And so, not knowing how to stay with the Enclaves, but also not cause a war against the Ethereals and the rest of the Tau, he actually leaves in exile. Now this is an incredible moment. He chooses his people over himself. Tzeentch and Khorne wanted to manipulate Farsight like they did with Horus or Lorgar, but he's like, no, he is his own man, and I can only imagine how much that must have annoyed the Chaos Pantheon. And so Farsight expects to die in exile, but he doesn't. You see, you know that fancy sword he has? It's called the Dawnblade, and it's more than just a fancy sword. He finds it when battling the Bloodthirster, and he uses it when killing orcs subsequently. And when using this blade, if you kill a being, you steal the years that being would have had. And so Farsight has killed a lot of orcs, so it would take an extremely long time for him to die. And orcs, as we know, are basically immortal, so it's actually thought that Farsight might actually be immortal too at this point. But Farsight obviously doesn't stay in exile forever. As you can imagine, one day the Tyranids come and he decides to come out of exile, form the Eight, and they actually create a weapon that destroys the Tyranids from the inside. And at this point, Farsight re-enters the story of 40k. And finally, we have Case, a gem GW sits on to this day. He is the character from the game Fire Warrior and from Dawn of War, and he's very beloved. But the Case we have in the books is very different to those characters. He's far colder. So for example, he goes into cryostasis without saying goodbye to Farsight and Shadowsun. I guess he was just sick of being a third wheel at that point. But there's a reason that he's so cold. All of the commanders that we've talked about today have personalities that really match the doctrines that they practice. Shadowsun is incredibly deadly and calculating, like a patient hunter. Farsight is a hot-blooded Violan who is very keen to go for the killing blow, but Case practices Monat. Monat actually means the lone warrior in Tau, and so if you practice that way of combat, you're not going to make a lot of friends. Case is then driven further into insanity, as whilst he's in stasis, he is actually still awake. And so he has 100 years to just think about how to kill and how to be a better weapon of war, and ultimately he becomes the living weapon. He is eventually unleashed against the Angels of Absolution and their fortress monastery. He actually tears through their ranks pretty easily, and they have to use an orbital strike to actually disable the ghost kill battlesuit that he's in, but even then he doesn't die. He actually flees and tries to elude recapture by the Tau. I'd be really interested to see what Games Workshop would do with a wild Case in the Imperium. Would he try and regroup with Farsight? It's implied that actually he was put awake in stasis deliberately, and if he realizes this, potentially he's become disillusioned with the way of the greater good. There's not actually as much lore on Case compared to the other two commanders. As you can imagine, he is shrouded in mystery. So that's all I'm going to cover from these three commanders today. I hope you'd agree that there are some really awesome parts to the lore of the students of Puretide. And that lore is only going to grow. GW have confirmed that they've already made a Case model who you can take as a Lord of War alongside any Tau army. That's actually technically a lie, but I thought it would be quite cool to think about just for a moment. But seriously, I hope all of these characters do get way more attention from Games Workshop, both in the game and in the story. There is so much potential, and I would be fascinated to see how these characters would interact with other characters from the 40k story. But thank you for watching this video. Please do like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Happy hobbying.